Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to find out, after 200 years of peace and prosperity, why it all falls apart in Rome. So we're going to go ahead and start by setting the scene, figuring out how we got to this point. Then we're going to talk about the kind of political history of the decline and fall before moving on to the reasons why this happened. And then we'll see the ultimate collapse in the city of Rome itself. So how did we get here? Well, the story of course starts way before the city of Rome even existed. So going back to the early Iron Age, all of Italy was divided amongst a diverse group of Italian tribes. The richest and most prosperous, most complex, and most powerful, of course, were the Etruscans. Now, in 753 BC, Romulus founds the city of Rome, and for the next 250 years, Rome is ruled by a series of 7 monarchs. And while they start out really good, they end not so good. And so in 509 BC, Lucius Junius Brutus overthrows the last of the kings, Tarquin the Proud, and sets up the Roman Republic. Now, the guiding ideology of the Roman Republic is simply there are no kings in Rome. No single person should have absolute power. And yet what we end up seeing is after 500 years of this ideology, at the end it's no longer tenable. Rome devolves into a series of very bloody civil wars, and in the end it's Octavian who ends up kind of the last man standing. And Rome, the Roman people, the Roman Senate, and Octavian have to negotiate what they're going to do. And what they decide to do is kind of set aside this ideology. On the surface, say that Rome is still functioning as a republic should, but in actuality, Octavian, who now call Augustus, ends up having complete control. So why did the Pax Romana succeed? Why for 200 years were these Roman emperors able to kind of keep Rome in a peaceful, powerful state of being? Well, we listed 10 reasons here, right? So the Roman army being one of them. At the same time, during these couple centuries, there are very kind of weak external enemies who are not able to make incursions into the Roman Empire. To govern the whole thing, they have a very light bureaucracy, meaning that they're able to govern a huge area with a very small number of people. And the way that they do that is through this trickle-down assimilation. They flip a couple of the local leaders at the top, and then they incentivize those local leaders to kind of make it worth their population's while to come over to the Roman way of doing things. Rome's also very accepting of foreign cultures, both kind of culturally and religiously. Basically, if you pay your taxes and you're willing to worship the emperor, anything else you want to do is up to you. And there were practical benefits as well. So Rome had relatively low taxes. Who doesn't like that? Something only like 5 to 10% of your income would go to taxes. And the common currency throughout the empire allowed for high volume, long distance trade, which connected all these different markets. So if there was a famine in France, grain from Egypt could be shipped there. And likewise, if you lived in Egypt, you could drink fine wine from France. And in order to make that happen, there was this excellent kind of infrastructure, roads and harbors and ports that allowed people to get from point A to point B kind of very cheaply and very quickly. Now, the reason a city like Rome with 1 million people was able to exist is all because of clean water. And so it's the aqueducts as well, another type of infrastructure that allow for these large cities to survive and kind of have healthy populations in them. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, it's that everybody agreed to this style of imperial rule. They were able to set aside that republican ideology and kind of accept that having one person in charge of things ended up being a little bit better for everybody than having kind of these oligarchic competitions between aristocrats. Now, that kind of raises the question, is it better to have a single kind of monarch rule and have things at peace? Or is it better to have a democracy or a republic where people have the power to influence their government, but be in a time of chaos? And that's a question you'll have to answer for yourself. Now, let's go ahead and look at the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. So, The kind of term that we're using here, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, isn't just something I made up. It actually goes back to this fine-looking fellow here, a guy by the name of Edward Gibbon. And in the late 18th century, from the year of our independence, 1776 to 1789, Edward Gibbon writes a massive kind of series of books titled The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And this thing spans more than 3,000 pages. So if you're ever kind of upset at the homework I'm giving you, just be happy that I'm not assigning this guy's books to read. Now, we saw in the early days of the empire, right after Augustus, who rules for 41 years, we get all these really wacky emperors, right? So we get Tiberius living on his villa, paranoid that he's always going to die. We get Caligula trying to make his horse the consul. We get Claudius with his wives cheating on him and eventually killing him. And then we get Nero fiddling while Rome burned. But despite all this kind of chaos personally, the empire at large is just fine, no big deal. And then we move into 150 years of having relatively good, strong rulers. And so we see people like Vespasian and Titus putting together the Colosseum. We see Hadrian rebuilding the Pantheon. We see Trajan erecting a triumphal column after his victory over the Dacians. And we see the statue, the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius sitting on the Capitoline Hill. And the last of those guys, Marcus Aurelius, who was emperor from 161 to 180 CE, is kind of the epitome of what an emperor should be. He wins battles abroad, and he's a good, kind of morally good leader at home. And we can see that in what he writes, the Meditations, and we end up, for that reason, calling him kind of the philosopher emperor. And if there was anybody that we wanted to have his true-born son actually take over, it's probably Marcus Aurelius' son. Up until this point, it tends not to be the actual true-born son of the emperor who ends up taking over. And what we see with Marcus Aurelius is finally, we're going to get that kind of direct descendant becoming the emperor, and what better guy could this happen to? Well, as it turns out, it doesn't work very well. So despite how awesome Marcus Aurelius is, it turns out his son is a guy by the name of Commodus, and he takes over upon Marcus Aurelius' death in 180 CE. Now, he's the first true son to become emperor in the entire 2 centuries. He turns out not to quite be the philosopher that his dad was, though. So Commodus loves the games, right? Commodus doesn't care at all about ruling the Roman Empire. What he wants to do is he wants to watch gladiatorial games, he wants to watch senators fight in gladiatorial games, he wants to fight himself in gladiatorial games. He kind of envisions himself as Hercules, right? The old Greek hero Heracles, reborn as himself, all right? And so you can see one of the coolest statues from ancient Rome here. We have Commodus, and he's wearing the lion skin, the skin of the Nemean lion, holding the club of Heracles. And in his left hand, we see him holding the kind of orb of the world. Now, he's even so bold as to rename the entire kind of city of Rome after himself. So he starts calling Rome, not Rome, but the Colonia Commodiana, right? Basically, Rome is now the colony of Commodus. So we start to get kind of rise once again of these wacky emperors, all right? But what we're going to see this time is because other things have started to change, it no longer has these benign effects. So after Commodus, we get a kind of new dynasty come in. And this is the Severan dynasty, and the first of those leaders was Septimius Severus, and he was a fairly effective leader. But upon his death, he ends up doing something a little weird. He ends up giving power to both of his sons. And we've seen previously how well it works when 2 people try to govern at once. We saw that when we had Octavian and Mark Antony and Lepidus, and within a couple years they start getting into fights, and Octavian wins the kind of rule of the entire Roman world. And something similar happens here. So what we're looking at here, this is Septimius Severus and his wife, and then we see their 2 kids down here. But you might notice that only one of those kids still has his face. So his 2 kids are named Caracalla and GETA. And for a couple years they rule together, but eventually Caracalla decides he no longer wants to share power with his brother. And so he makes kind of a power play. He kills his brother, and then he goes across Rome, erasing all memory of his brother's existence. And this is what we call in Latin the damnatio memoriae, literally the erasure of memory, all right? Or the damnation of memory. And so we can see on this kind of tondo here, we can see Caracalla, looking good. His brother's face is erased. On the arch of Septimius Severus, once again, we can see Septimius Severus, the dad up here. We can see the statue of GETA once again erased down below. Now, despite this kind of conflict, right, almost the beginnings of a civil war once again between these two brothers, Rome's still doing all right. They're still hanging on. And Caracalla actually builds one of the greatest monuments in the city of Rome today. If you just go down to the southern part of the city, you'll see these massive brick structures arising out of the surrounding parks. And these are known as the Baths of Caracalla. They're built in the early 3rd century CE, and they're still used for kind of modern theatrical performances. And when you look at this in terms of scale, in terms of ancient Roman architecture, this is one of the biggest sites in the ancient Roman city. Moving on from there, the emperors get even more crazy. So next up, we have ELAGABALUS. So after Caracalla dies, and he doesn't die peacefully, he's actually murdered by his own Praetorian Guard, ELAGABALUS takes over. And if you think the name Elagabalus sounds a little bit weird, well, it's because Elagabal is actually a god from the east. And Elagabalus likes this god. He associates him with the Roman god Sol Invictus, what we'd call the unconquered sun. And he decides to make this god, the unconquered sun, the premier god in Rome, above even Jupiter. And so now we see these kind of crazy emperors not just being personally kind of weird, but starting to affect core things in the kind of Roman culture, things like Roman religion. Now, Elagabalus only lasts 4 years, and it's starting kind of shortly after that we have the end of the Severan dynasty. And this launches us into something that we call the 3rd century crisis. So for about 50 years, in the middle of the 3rd century, we get absolute chaos politically in the Roman world. And nowhere is that better exemplified than the best named of all Roman emperors. That's right, our guy, Pupienus, all right? So Pupienus rules in 238 CE, and this is also known as the Year of the Six Emperors. Now, he's not the first one, he's somewhere in the middle, and he's actually a co-emperor with this guy over here, Balbinus. Now, they're really skeptical of each other, right? Each one thinks that the other one's gonna kill him. And so Pupienus ends up getting this German bodyguard, right? This bodyguard of German soldiers to protect himself. And Balbinus keeps thinking that Pupienus is going to use this bodyguard to overthrow him. And one day they're fighting about this. And Pupienus goes to Balbinus and he says, "We are in danger, right? The Praetorian Guard, our own protectors, are coming to kill us. Let me bring in the German bodyguard to protect us both." And Balbinus is like, "No way, you can't do that. You want to do that so you can kill me." And Pupienus is like, no, I want to save you." And as they're having this argument, the Praetorian Guard busts into the room. They kill them both, and they set up a new emperor, right? One of the next ones in line in the Year of the Six Emperors. So again, not only does he have an awesome name, this also totally exemplifies what's going on in the middle of the 3rd century CE. Now, towards the end of the 3rd century, people start to try to get things in order once again. And the best person at that was this guy, Diocletian. Now, what Diocletian ends up doing is he divides the empire into 4 quadrants, right? And he has this new political system where there are 2 people at the top, known as the Augusti, and there are 2 people right below him, known as the Caesars. They each govern a different area, semi-independently. And then when the Augusti retire, the Caesars take over, and then they adopt kind of new heirs. So that's the plan. And it works for a very short period of time. And that's until, once again, people learn that they can't share power. And it's actually Constantine coming out of England, way off the map here, up here to the left, moving his way down into Italy, eventually winning a big battle outside of Rome, and then pushing east, reunifying the empire. But that reunification wasn't to last. Within another half century, a little bit more than that, I guess, we see the end of the Roman Empire as we know it, as it's split in half, never to be reunited. So at the death of Theodosius I in 395 CE, Rome splits into two, never to be put back together again. So that's kind of the political history of what's going on as Rome starts to fall apart. We see this incredibly rapid turnover of emperors, and we see the kind of empire itself start to fragment. Now let's look at the reasons why this is happening. So, one of the main reasons that Rome was successful was because of its great army. And the changes to that army are one of the main reasons it starts to fall apart. So as the population of Romans themselves begins to shrink, they still have this massive area they need to defend. And the way that they do that is by hiring mercenaries. So they hire mercenaries kind of from these different tribes around the borders of the empire. And while they're incredibly fierce fighters, they have no loyalty to the city of Rome. Also, it's really expensive. The other thing that we get is we get the Huns, a kind of barbarian tribe from the east, right, from Asia, pushing westward. Now, the Huns themselves fight a couple battles with Rome, but it's actually the kind of chain reaction that the Huns cause that really causes problems. So the Huns come in from the east, and as they hit these other barbarian tribes, those tribes then must react and start kind of moving, all right? And eventually those tribes push really far in to what was going on in the Roman Empire at that time. So Attila the Hun comes in and starts this chain reaction of barbarian movements. At the same time, economically, all things are going to hell, all right? Inflation is going crazy, and you can see in this chart here what's happened. So for 200 years, during the normal part of the empire, the Roman denarius, the silver Roman coin, has maintained its silver kind of content pretty well, right? Going down from something close to kind of 90, maybe down to around 80, but for around 200 years, it's still really high in silver. And then during the 3rd century, what ends up happening is every time Rome has a monetary crisis, rather than try to get more silver, they just cut the amount of silver in their coins, right? This is called the process of debasement. So anytime they have a monetary crisis, they just print more money. And what happens when you just print more money? Well, the costs of things go up. And so all of a sudden, the cost of regular things, bread and weapons and clothes, everything, right, is going sky high. And it doesn't help that some of the really, really rich people are starting to just try to remove themselves from the system. Taxes have gone way up, and the solution for a lot of the rich people is to just move out to the countryside and not pay taxes anymore. One of the things economically that kind of Rome was very reliant on in the early days was slave labor. And this is actually something that allowed them to be very, very productive. Now, the downside to this is what happens when you stop having a big influx of slaves. So now for a while, right, Rome has kind of had their massive extent of empire, but they're not gaining new lands. And what happens then is you're not getting new slaves. And what happens then is you have a shortage of labor, all right? And so you don't have the same amount of slave labor that you had earlier. One of the things that happens along with barbarian invasions is not only do they kind of try to kill you, they also break up trade networks. So one of the reasons Rome worked really, really well is because things like France was connected to Egypt, right? Via long-distance trade across the Mediterranean. And you could trade things from Gaul to Spain and from Spain to Rome. And all of a sudden, when you have barbarians going through all these places, you can't do that long-distance trade anymore. And what that means is when there's a crisis one place, those other places aren't really there to be able to help out. If you have a famine in France, now all of a sudden, you don't have that Egyptian grain to help you out. Now on top of all this, we've got political instability at the very kind of top echelon. So emperors are dying like crazy, right? We had the story of Pupienus in the year of the 6 emperors. But you can see in the chart here just how kind of crazy this is. So this is broken down by every 50 years. And what we can see is that in the middle of the 3rd century, right, there are like twice as many emperors as any other period in time. And what that means is that the average rule of each emperor is about 2 years. And you can try to imagine maintaining stability while the people at the very, very top continue to be killed and new people continue to be installed by the military. And to just see how chaotic this is, you can look at one of my favorite things here, right? What we call the death map. All right? And so what we're looking at with the death map is where emperors have died and whether they died of natural causes or, let's say, unnatural causes. Now, you would hope that it's the few blue dots that were the unnatural deaths, right? The assassinations. But it's actually the opposite. The few blue dots that you see on here, all right, only 3 out of like 20 in Rome. Those are the natural deaths. The black ones, all those people were killed, all right? And so what we're looking at is a huge amount, not just of turnover at the top, but it's incredibly dangerous to be the Roman emperor. And so, you really have to wonder, like, why did anybody want this job? It's more dangerous to be the Roman emperor than it is to be in like any gang in the worst part of any city, all right? Incredibly dangerous job. Our 7th reason is the division of the empire. And so we saw that this first happens under Diocletian, and then for good at the end of the reign of Theodosius I in 395 CE. Now this works temporarily. In the beginning, what the division does is it allows for smaller kind of administrative districts, and it makes them a little bit easier to govern. But in the long run, what this ends up meaning is that we no longer have a unified front against major external forces, right? They're not combining their powers to fight off kind of powerful invasions. The other thing it means is that the East at this time is fairly strong, right? You'd think that would be Rome, but Roman power has actually shifted from the West over to the East. And so as barbarian tribes come in from over here, they basically avoid the Eastern Roman Empire, and this is all diverted onto the West. Now, one of the things that we're getting here is overexpansion of the military and kind of the spending that goes along with it. Rome has thousands of miles of border, and that all needs to be protected. And in order to protect it, you have to have troops. And so you get crazy things like Hadrian's Wall. And there was actually another one after that called the Antonine Wall, even further north. So these crazy kind of expenditures at the very edges of empire. And not only do you have to build this, you have to staff it. And so Rome is going into huge amounts of debt just to be able to protect its borders. Another reason that's been put forth, and this was actually one of the main arguments of Edward Gibbon, right, who wrote those 3,000 pages about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, is that it's religious and cultural changes in Rome that are causing a lot of the kind of problems and changes towards the end. And one of the big ones, of course, is the adoption of Christianity, first by Constantine, and then for good, right, as the state religion of Rome, about 50 years after that. Now, the kind of line of thinking here is that when you switch from kind of the traditional Roman religion to Christianity, what you're doing is you're taking the focus away from kind of the imperial cult, from the emperor himself, and putting it on a different deity. And so the money and things like that that would normally go towards building these kind of civic monuments in Rome now is all being funneled towards Christianity. And this argument has kind of fallen out of favor in recent times, but there may still be something to the idea that the kind of shift from paganism to Christianity, it's changed one of the kind of core features of what it meant to be Roman. And finally, we get the most proximate cause of the fall, and that is the invasion of the barbarians. And we saw it was Attila the Hun coming from Asia who ends up starting this kind of chain reaction, but then a whole slew of different barbarian tribes that invade the Roman Empire. And what you're looking at here is a sarcophagus, right? Like basically a fancy coffin from the 3rd century CE. And this was a common motif at this time. This isn't an emperor or anything like that. It's simply a successful general at that time. And you can see the kind of battlefield chaos that's going on the sarcophagus. Now, where is the death blow actually dealt? Well, let's take a look at the city of Rome. In 410 CE, the Visigoths, one of the barbarian tribes displaced by the Huns, end up making their way into Rome and sacking the city. And this is a monumental event. This is the first time in 800 years since the Gauls sacked Rome in 390 BC. This is the first time in 800 years that the city of Rome has been sacked. Now, the Goths don't have any interest in staying there, right? They burn the place, they loot the city, but then they go off and they go home. And Rome tries to get it back together, but it doesn't last that long. A mere 45 years later, the Vandals, another of the barbarian tribes from up here that get pushed by the Huns, they end up coming in, swooping in from North Africa up to Rome, and they end up sacking the city in 455. And they really burn the place, and they really loot the place, and that's actually where we get our word vandalism from. But once again, we don't see them kind of setting up shop and taking over the city itself for the long term. And so Rome has a little bit of time and they try to get it back together, but now it's even shorter. And a mere 21 years later, we see the fall of Rome for good. So the Ostrogoths, another one of the barbarian tribes that get pushed by the Huns, make their way down into Rome. And in 476 CE, Odoric the Ostrogoth ends up accepting the surrender of the last emperor in the city of Rome, a guy by the name of Romulus Augustulus. It translates very literally as kind of Romulus, the little Augustus. And so we see here Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor in Rome, on one of the coins, and we see a depiction over here of him submitting his surrender to the Ostrogoth king, Odoric. So, 476 CE, that's when the last emperor in Rome is deposed. So let's wrap up with a couple thoughts. Well, why did this all happen, right? After things going so well for so long, a couple reasons. One, they've started to outsource the army. Two, the Huns have pushed in from the east, and this has caused a chain reaction. Three, inflation is rampant. They've started debasing the coinage, and that's caused prices to rise drastically. Four, there was an over-reliance on slave labor, and then when the slave kind of population dries up, they have nobody to do the work. This also leads to a breakdown in trade networks, especially the kind of barbarian invasions. There's rampant political instability, something like 2 years per emperor before they're killed and the next one is installed. Rome has overexpanded itself, and religious and cultural changes, especially the shift to Christianity, has in some ways changed what it means to be a Roman. And then we have the division of the empire itself. And in the short term, this works. It makes things easier to administrate. But in the long term, this kind of prevents them from putting a unified front against invading forces. And then finally, our last reason, right, is the invading forces themselves. That chain reaction started by the Huns that ends up sacking Rome again and again and again in the 5th century. 410 by the Visigoths, 455 by the Vandals, and 476 for good by the Ostrogoths, who end up completing the decline and fall of the Roman Empire.